Hello, and welcome to this webinar that is brought to you today by Storied. I am Heather Honnert, and I am very excited today to share with you Genealogical Gold, mining rich stories from historical records. So we're going to spend some time looking at different historical records and the types of information that you can pull from them to help tell your family stories. So I want to first start just by talking about some of the important reasons why you want to use historical records for stories. You can verify facts and add authenticity to your stories. It really helps you add that documented evidence to kind of corroborate your stories. And we're going to talk about, how each one of these kind of play into different records as we look at them. This one is one of my favorites. I think this one is really important to be able to add that factual piece to stories. The next thing is, I think it really brings those historical records, bring ancestors to life. It breathes life into descriptions, and it may be a kind of a general description of a person, or it may be, if you're lucky, a physical description of that ancestor. So I think records really kind of breathe life into those people. The next one is one of my favorites. I love to be able to connect with place and time and use chronological structure. So the idea here is that it kind of builds historical and social context around your ancestors. And I think it really helps that chronological structure kind of builds a timeline of your ancestors and where they were and when they were in certain places. Really, I think helps add to the overall story of your family. I think historical records and the information you find in them can inspire and spark curiosity. Some of the tidbits of info make such great fodder for stories. And again, we'll kind of talk about those little nuggets that you can pull out of historical records and use those to help tell fantastic stories. And then the last one is family dynamics. I mean, sometimes you didn't know that an ancestor existed until you found their family members and relationships inside of historical records. So all of these are great reasons of why you want to take those historical records and then use that information to help tell your family stories. So one thing that I want to talk about that I think is very important, typically when people are pulling information from historical records, and I myself have been 100% guilty of this in the past. So a lot of times people are looking for just that main kind of basic name and date information. And once they find it, they leave all of those other pieces out there. And they are so important to kind of dig those all up and use every little bit that you can. And this is an example of how I would use the record and the information I find in it. So what I will do a lot of times is take the information that are kind of the titles or the headers of the different columns of a historical record, and I will kind of jot those down and use those to help make my notes of my ancestors that I find on a page. So example here, the top one is a census record and all of the tidbits that you can pull from that. And then the bottom one is a passenger list, the Baltimore passenger list from an ancestor I pulled. So make sure you grab all of those headers. And why are those important? Because it's not just names and dates. Those headers can include all of this information and more. So you might get citizenship information, date of immigration, an occupation, the port of departure, languages spoken, and this list is not all inclusive. There are so many other things that you can find from historical records. So let's dive in and look at some different types of historical records and how I might pull some information from those and different tips that I've used that help me when I'm finding all of those little golden nuggets of information. So the first one here is a census record. And I've tried to pull ones that I've used in the past, all of the different types of records, so that it's a kind of a practical concept of pulling information from historical records. So this census record is actually one, the full image is here on the right. This is one I used in a research project for a friend of mine. And I've taken the section that was the most important from the right, and I've kind of blown it up here so you can see it in color coded to help really view that image. So the family that I was looking for and I was researching was this family here in yellow, the Andrew Pleasant family. And I could have stopped there and not paid attention to anything else that was on that page. And by doing that, I would have missed a lot of information. So, quick tip number one, look at the neighbors. Look at the people that are on that page with the family that you are looking at and see what kind of other people are popping up. This is a prime example. So, the family in green, those are the neighbors of the Andrew Pleasant family. Andrew's daughter, Edith, and William's son, Kenneth, ended up marrying each other later on. So the families were neighbors and their kids got married to each other. And again, if I was just focused on Andrew's family at that time, I might not have noticed that his next door neighbor was his future in-laws. And then below that in blue, we have the North Goodson family. And North's daughter is married to William Cole in green. So you can see how those kind of all work together. And again, this is great. This is great information for stories for your family history and your family tree. The other tip I would give you is to make sure that you look at before and after pages. So I have found kind of in the same vein here where I've got other families that are connected to them in some way, either relations or friends that you can find that could be on the page before your family or after your family on the census. So I always look at a page or two before and a page or two after the ancestors that I'm currently working on to see what I might find close to them on the census. The next type of record is a birth certificate. So this tip is really important. And I think a lot of people don't necessarily take the time for this. They really get focused on their direct line ancestors. And so you might miss out on some information. When I found this particular birth certificate, this is my grandmother's sister. And so I wouldn't have thought necessarily to look here to find information about my great-grandparents. Obviously, my great-grandparents are her parents as well as my grandma's parents. So some things that I found about them that I wasn't sure of or didn't know about before. So the first one is my great-grandfather was listed as a mechanic on this birth certificate, and he had been for 18 years when Norma was born. So that is an example of something I could find and then use that information to tell a story about my great-grandfather. The other one is on this particular one, I didn't know that my great-grandmother had 8 children, and it shows 7 of them as living. So one of them had passed away. So sometimes you can find, especially between census records, because census records are 10 years apart, sometimes you can find information about siblings of an ancestor that would not show up anywhere but on maybe a birth certificate like this, because they were maybe they were born and passed sometime within a 10-year period of a census. So a good idea to look at those types of things. So this is my push and nudge to get you to look at indirect lines. It's not my grandmother's birth certificate. It's her sister's. So thinking about other people that are related to an ancestor and how you might be able to garner information from those records. Death certificates. So this was one that was really kind of a convoluted attempt to get to the truth here. And my quick tip is to check multiple records. That should always be an important thing that you do when you're looking for information about your family members. So I want to talk first about this newspaper article that's right here, and it says his death at only 40 years of age. This is talking about my great-grandfather. And the story that I knew growing up, and even until about, honestly, 6 months ago, was that my great-grandfather had passed away because he saw an automobile accident and someone was pinned under the car, and he helped to get them out from under the car by lifting the car up partially, and that caused his untimely death, an early death at the age of 40. And that was the story I'd always been told. This newspaper article kind of backed that up a bit. This was from in the 70s. And this is the story that my dad knew about his grandfather, that's how he passed away. And as I got into the records and started digging a little bit more, that was not the case. And so that was a story that had just been fabricated. I mean, maybe that did happen. He did lifted a car off of somebody, possibly. But the real cause of his death, and you can tell that from the death certificate here, is he died of sarcoma, which is another way to say cancer. And then I found a newspaper article that indicated that around the time that he passed, he was at Methodist Hospital in Indianapolis being given radium treatments for glands on his throat. He died of throat cancer. So I think this is a great way to pull information and to make sure that your stories are accurate based on the information you find for them. The next one is passport applications. I do love passport applications. These are a wealth of information. So quick tip on this one is to make sure that you look at the page after the actual application, because a lot of times these applications on the next page will have a picture of your ancestor. That was not the case on this particular one, but a lot of times they do. So make sure you look at the next page. And again, I think that's always the case with historical records. Look a page before, a page after, maybe even a couple, to see if you're missing anything that's important. This one is great. This one is an application for my husband's great-grandfather. And he immigrated to the United States in the 1880s. And this was him getting his passport application in 1911 when he was going back to visit family members in Germany. And so one thing I pulled from this, I love that it shows descriptions of applicants. This is a chance, if you don't have any photos, to really get a good in your mind visual of what that individual would look like. I do have pictures of his great-grandfather, and so when I look at this, I think this is very accurate based on the photos that I've seen of him. But one thing, as a great example on here, is it tells me that his eyes were blue, and the photos I have of him are not color photos. And so this is a great way to know that he has blue eyes. And so does my husband. So maybe that's where he got them from. But this is a great, passport applications are really helpful when it comes to kind of getting a physical description and maybe even a photo of a person that you may not have had before. And then the last one, this is my very favorite historical record story that I get to share with people. And so this is a Baltimore passenger list. And this is an example of not really looking at a historical record closely the first time you look at it. So this example is when I found the same person that was on the passport application, Frank Honert, my husband's great-grandfather. And so I found him on the passport, or on the Baltimore passenger list, and I was super excited. And I left it at that. I saw his name, I saw his age, and I kind of moved on from there. And so look at those again, look at those categories at the top and look at the descriptions. If I had paid attention, I would have realized that he was in steerage when he came across. And so kind of thinking about what that might have been like. I have the name of the ship, so looking up information on the ship and using that to help tell my story. But the reason I use this one is because Steve had told me a story that was passed down for many, many decades in his family about how his great-grandfather Honert had met his future wife on the ship coming across from Germany. And that's a pretty hard story to corroborate. And so he told me that. I'm like, oh, that's the cutest, greatest little story. I sure wish I could help to prove that. Couple of years ago, I was looking again at this passenger list, and not having looked at it closely the first time, I noticed that just one person away from his great-grandfather is this Lizette Plager. Now, I would have been looking for an Elizabeth Plager, and this one is Lizette. So this is my husband's great grandmother, and she was only one person away on the passenger list from his great grandfather. Do I know if that story is 100% true? Absolutely not. However, based on this information from this passenger list, that is definitely a story that I feel comfortable telling and sharing with other members of the family, and then using this historical record to kind of back up as my evidence for that. So this is a great example of using that information to help build and tell your story. Again, a quick tip, looking at those pages before and after, and then using something like this to help corroborate a story. So don't let those historical records be daunting. Don't let all of the great nuggets of gold information that are hidden in those historical records, don't let those go to waste. Mine as many of those as you can and use those to help tell absolutely fantastic family stories for future generations to enjoy. Best of luck in your research.